Welcome to our webinar, Make the Shift to Electric Mobility, the New Fueling Network. My name is Catherine. I'm working at ChargePoint in marketing. And today we're broadcasting from several locations throughout Europe. I'm here in Munich, and then we have Amsterdam and also the UK here. With me are my colleagues André ten Bloemendaal, he's the Vice President Sales for Europe, and also Joe Gorman, who is looking after the UK, Ireland, and the Nordics. And before we jump into the webinar, let me quickly walk you over a few housekeeping rules. Please take a moment to locate the Q&A feature you have on the bottom of your webinar screen, and please use the feature and this function to ask questions to Joe and Andre. You can raise it at any time throughout the webinar, and at the end of the webinar, we will have around 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. Either we will do it live or directly in the Q&A window. And additionally, this session will be recorded and we will made it available to you afterwards. The ones who just joined, welcome to our webinar, Make the Shift to Electric Mobility, the New Fueling Network. I would now hand over to my colleague Joe to tell you more about the New Fueling Network. Please.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. And good morning to my esteemed colleague, Andre. How are you this morning, Andre?
I'm doing well. Absolutely.
Excellent. Let's get going then. So, what to expect from the next hour? We're going to touch fairly generally on a number of topics around the shift to e-mobility and how our perspective on charging and how it works and how it will evolve. And our plan is over the next few weeks and months to have some further webinars where we'll go in depth around a number of the key topics. So I think the next one we'll have after this that Catherine will tell us about at the end is specifically going to talk about how the shift to electric fleets is happening. So we will do a number of other webinars that go into more detail. But for today, we're going to talk about some evidence that shows that the shift is definitely happening. What's driving that adoption? What's happening? Why are people making that decision? Why should you care? Why should businesses care about this shift? What's going on that means businesses should have an interest in it? How and where will charging happen? This will be picked up by Andre later in the presentation. Why we believe that networked charging is an absolute must. Some things to consider when looking at charging projects. And then we'll carve out at least 10 minutes at the end for all the questions that hopefully will come in during the presentation. So, before we get going, a little gentle survey of all the people on here to see how progressive we all are. And Catherine will launch the survey that hopefully you can all see. So the question is, are you already driving an EV, or are you planning to drive one in the next 12 months? Yes or no? And the follow-up question then is, what was your top choice if you've already bought an EV, or what would your top reason be if you're, when looking at EVs in the future? So we'll let you all have a crack at the poll, and then in a second we'll see what those results are. Yeah. About 3/4 of people have voted now, so we'll just give it another few seconds. We're up to about 85% now, I think. Just a few more seconds, and then we'll call the results. So I think it's in. So an enormous 71% of people on this call are either driving or planning to drive an EV in the next 12 months. Well, given that in most of the surveys, about 1 in 10 of the UK population are considering EV for the next purchase, we've got I think, Andre, you'd agree, we've got a very progressive EV-minded audience on this call, which I guess is what we were hoping for, right?
Absolutely right. And
Yeah.
70%, that's not a small majority, that's a real majority.
Yeah.
So good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And interesting that the green agenda and sustainability is the top choice there for making that shift. But very close behind is the cost piece, which is interesting, and we'll talk about as we go down, because I think it is genuinely becoming clearer that that total cost of ownership in many of the categories of EVs is now cheaper than buying an ICE vehicle. So it's interesting to see that reason now being prominent in people's decision making. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Very enlightening. So we'll move on from there. I think, Catherine, we can remove the poll. I don't know if everybody's seeing that or whether I just need to close it myself. I need to close it myself. Okay, so the shift is definitely happening. Bit of a global stat here in terms of the forecast, which everybody can see on the screen, which talks about overall vehicle sales and the passenger fleet. But I think very quickly I want to move that into some real statistics in terms of what's already happened. Just a very quick look here about what's happening in the UK versus some of our peers on the continent. As you can see, we're fairly close beside a very similar economy and country in Germany, of course. And okay, our growth at the moment looks higher at 120% versus Norway, for example. But we have to take into account that the prevalence of EV vehicles is already much, much higher in Norway, for example, than it is in the UK. So I think what you can see here is growth on a par with some of our colleagues in Europe. But of course, in overall terms, we lag behind some places like Norway. And I think, Andre, perhaps in the Netherlands as well, where the growth rate is perhaps slower, but the prevalence is already higher there than it is in the UK.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you look at adoption, in Norway, you are at a staggering 75% of all cars sold are EVs. In the Netherlands, you're now consistent close to 20. So they are getting there as well. Whereas Germany, France, and the UK still have a long way to go. But if you see that they more than double quarter over quarter, with the quarter in 2020 being partially influenced by COVID already, that really looks promising from the growth perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's look at the UK specifically then. Some data here from the SMMT, which is Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. So these are the official registrations, and this is the latest that just came out for June's closing figures. So what can we see here? What is this telling us? Well, of course, we all know that the sale in cars slumped during the COVID period, but not, of course, in all categories from a year-on-year perspective. So, okay, these charts tell us that in the diesel and petrol categories, in particular, are down, way down on last year, and the only categories that are up are those that are electric in some way, shape, or form. But the category I want to pull out most here in terms of what this is telling us, the highest growth rate overall for June year on year, and from a year-to-date perspective on last year, is the pure electric category, the battery electric vehicle, BEV, which is up 260% from a June perspective on this time last year. So we can see that all those categories of electrification are in growth, and that the traditional ICE vehicles are down. But it is, in fact, the highest growth is seen in the pure battery electric vehicle category, which is really, really encouraging. So, also worth touching on other forms of transport, because this is not just about the cars that we all drive as consumers and workers, and how we get ourselves about the country and to the shops. This is also about all the other forms of transport that we use and that are used to deliver goods, transport people, and all the other things that we rely on as a country. There was an article recently in The Guardian which talked about government's plans to electrify all buses with a really aggressive target of 2030, which of course is even more aggressive than the 2035 ban on ICE vehicles, which is again really, really encouraging a massive reduction of emissions possible by driving that particular category. And of course, fleets, particularly commercial fleets around delivery, logistics, engineering vans, all those sorts of categories. Again, big moves happening in those categories. UPS have made a big announcement about 10,000 new vehicles that they're doing with Arrival. Amazon, 100,000 electric delivery vans as part of their plans. And an announcement just yesterday that Centrica, which of course owns British Gas, and I think have the third biggest fleet in the UK, have also announced the biggest deal so far for electric vans in the UK with Vauxhall. So some really big announcements happening in that side of things. And of course, some of the cost benefits that can be achieved by companies looking to electrify their fleets can be pretty staggering. We've seen examples of as much as 50% in some cases. So when we get to later on in the presentation, when Andre talks about when and where charging will happen, we'll also touch on how that impacts fleet, how that impacts companies with large fleets, and how we help them to electrify. And of course, in our follow-up webinar that we have next month or the month after, we'll be very much focused on this category as we go into more detail on this really important segment of electrification. So, what's driving the adoption? Why is it happening? Well, our survey kind of tells us a lot, really, doesn't it? People are very minded about sustainability and wanting to make choices in that regard. The costs, of course, have come down, and we can actually make savings in many of the categories now. And sort of three of the areas that we see, clearly governments are creating and driving the policy agenda. We've got a lot of, obviously, the car makers now are bringing out models hand over fist. We've got lots of the manufacturers now bringing out models across the different categories. And of course, our attitudes as consumers and as companies are changing, as our survey showed before. Just to drill into a bit more detail then in some of the things that are happening. Of course, here there are some financial incentives that are helping us all to make the right choice. We recently heard the zero company car tax initiative, which was released last month or the month before, I think, which means that company car drivers will no longer pay any tax at all on electric vehicles, which is big. And there are a number of grants, of course, that are available, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And of course, as we touched on before, those grants are helping the whole process of making the total cost of ownership lower for an EV than it is for a traditional vehicle. Lease Plan, one of the big leasing companies, recently did a big analysis on this. And in more than 50% of different categories and analyses, electric trumps ICE in terms of its cost profile. And the range, depending on what kind of vehicle you're driving in those categories, was somewhere between 5 and 15%, which takes into account mileage, size of the car, those types of things. We've of course got government regulation, which you talked about before. Here, everybody's aware of the 2035 target for ending all sales of petrol, diesel, and hybrid vehicles. We've got various sort of councils that are looking at clean air zones and congestion charging and those sorts of initiatives. And one really important one, which people may or may not be aware of, is the new regulations around new buildings, particularly new commercial buildings, where if you're now creating an office or a workplace with a car park, you're obliged to have at least one charging station per 10 spaces. So that will drive, again, that adoption in terms of as we see new property and new developments open up across the country. And of course, as we talked about before, we've got people's attitudes changing and people wanting to, as we saw on the survey before, do the right thing and make all the choices in terms of moving to those vehicles. And of course, what we're also seeing is businesses wanting to play a big role in that, in terms of enabling that change for their employees, and of course making sure that they reduce their carbon footprint, which is generally part of most businesses' key initiatives at the moment. So just to touch on grants, there is due to be an announcement today about the COVID recovery plan. It seems that perhaps the latest thoughts that the government grant would increase around plug-in cars may not happen, but we will find out probably this week whether there is an increase. But at the moment, it's 3,000 from a car perspective and 8,000 from a van perspective. And then from a charging point of view, it's £300, £350 from a workplace perspective, up to a maximum of 14,000, which is about 40 ports. And then from a home charge scheme, again, the OLEV grant of £350 off the hardware in the install. So some really, really compelling reasons of why to do this now, supported by the government. And I think, last but not least on what's driving adoption, of course, all of the big players now that we know and love in the auto space are producing lots and lots of new models to suit all the different categories. This is not just a Tesla or a small end game from some of the cars like the Nissan Leaf, which have been out a long time, but you can now find vehicles in most of the major categories that we all know and love. And of course, range is extending with lots and lots of vehicles now at well over 200 miles in terms of the range capability. So we're just going to talk for a few minutes about why should you care? Why should businesses care? Because we talked a lot so far really about individuals and why individuals are making this change, but why should businesses care? What role do businesses have to play in this? Well, there's a number of areas really. Cost, of course, in its own right is one. There are opportunities for businesses to reduce their costs from a tax, from a fueling, from a maintenance perspective in terms of operating EVs as fleet vehicles or as company car schemes than ICE vehicles. I think what's most staggering for me in all this is that from research we've done ourselves in multiple countries and working with other companies, we found that employees are 6 times more likely to choose and buy an EV if their company, the place they park on a regular basis, offers charging at work. 6 times more likely. So you can very quickly see that us as organisations, as businesses, have a huge role in helping people to make that shift. Increasingly, people are just going to see this as a commodity. People will expect that when they go to work, they have the ability to charge. They want to drive an EV. They expect us as businesses and leaders in businesses to make it easy for them to do it. And of course, it makes sense for organisations to help and make this adoption easy, because they can then be, companies can be leaders in how we help to become sustainable and save the environment. I think as well, I maybe should have titled this, "Why should businesses care now?" Because, when you look at what's happening with the different grants, the amount of money that the government is putting into this right now, there's kind of a message behind it that now is the time to act. If you look at some of the mature markets that Andre described before, like Norway, where already 75% of purchases are for electric vehicles, the grants there are tailing off. So, which is to be expected. This is really designed to kickstart the growth. And then, of course, those grants will go. We don't know when. They're there at the moment, but it's fairly obvious that over time they will decrease. So it does make sense for organisations who are thinking about this and should be thinking about it, that now is the time to invest to get the most help that you can from the government. So just some of the reasons there about why, as organisations, we should care about this journey. Now, what I'd like to do is to spend a bit of time now, and I'll hand over to Andre at this point, to talk about how and where will most charging happen. Andre is a bit of an expert on this, so I will hand over to you, Andre, and I will do the slides for you. So tell me when you want me to move.
Thank you for calling me an expert. You know, but most people call me a nerd, which is probably exactly the same, but anyway. So one thing to add before we go into this, in the whole TCO, and you know, we got a question also, how long do we expect the zero tax incentive to last? It all has to do with what you indicated, Joe, the cost of the car itself, right? So at this moment in time, you need some subsidy to get the cars in tune with the price of an ICE, a combustion engine car. That's mainly driven by the battery pack, not by the engine itself. The engine, in fact, is much cheaper than a combustion engine. So the main difference is, or practically only the only one difference is the cost of the battery pack. So if you look 2 years back, the cost of the battery was given by the price per kilowatt hour of capacity in the battery. And you actually were at 400 euros about for 1 kilowatt hour of capacity. And then you can imagine if you have a 90 kilowatt hour battery in your car, like the Teslas had at that moment in time, you know, there was a considerable amount of the cost of the production of the car was in the battery itself, which made the car more expensive than the other cars. At this moment, we are at 100 euro per kilowatt hour, so we are at a quarter already. And it's assumed that in 3 years' time, we will be below 60. That means that the equilibrium between the production cost of an ICE car and the production cost of a battery charged vehicle will be within 2 years. So actually the expectation is that car manufacturers can produce the car at the same cost as an ICE car within the coming 2 years. And at that moment in time, you know, there is no reason to give subsidies and to use public money for spending on you know, the cars, because that only triggers incentives for some people and not for all people, right? One thing to add here maybe is that if you look at the capacity of those batteries, also those you see going up, because while it's more cheaper to produce the batteries, you know, it's less a burden on the cost price to get a higher capacity in. So you see capacities rise actually as a result of that. So just to give that as a little bit of additional information to what you said already.
Yeah.
So then one of the things is that you need to charge the car. You know, that's a big difference between an ICE car and a battery vehicle, which is that you feed energy in the car. That's still the same. In an ICE car, you do that by the means of petrol or diesel. And you generally do that at the moment the indicator in your dashboard indicates that your tank is almost empty. So you drive till the indicator tells you to go somewhere. Then the cost-conscious people, they look in an app and see where it's more cheap to go and get their petrol topped up, and they go there, and other people just take the very next gas station, go there, fill their tanks, and drive happily ever after till the indicator blinks again. For people that drive an EV, and that was about 70% of the audience here, they know that it's different if you get electrons as the mean of energy in your car. Because if you do that with electrons, we all know that it takes longer to get the electrons in your car than to get the liters in your car. And that will not change that rapidly for some reasons, and I will provide you the reasons why that will not change, maybe ever. So while that takes a little bit longer, and while everybody started a few years back with some range anxiety, you know, can I drive the mileage that I need to drive? You know, is there enough capacity available where I can charge my car? Are there enough chargers available, etc., etc.? people started to get into a different behavior. And the different behavior is, if you park your car for a longer time, then you get it connected to the grid and start charging. And that means that, contrary to 1 time per week or 2 weeks going to a gas station, you may find yourself 3-4 times per day connecting to a charger. And that is a completely different behavior, which means that, in general, people driving an EV, particularly after they just switched, you find those people always leaving wherever they leave from with a full battery or a nearly full battery. So that's a completely different situation than what we had before. So if you switch to the next slide, in fact, and that's interesting to see in Europe, all over Europe, regardless the country and regardless the level of penetration, we see this behavior. You see about 40% of all the sessions will take place in and around your home. About 40% of the charging sessions take place in and around your workplace. And only 20% of the sessions is what we call public and transit. So that may be a charger at the highway, which it may be a DC fast charger, etc., etc. And I have to be extremely careful, and I want to be respectful to the audience, of course. But what I tend to compare this with is your toilet behavior, if I may. Which means that, I know nobody that plans to go to the toilet while being in transit. You normally plan to do that at home or at your workplace, wherever it's convenient, but you don't do that while you're on the way. It's the same with charging. If you have charged your battery at home or at the workplace, there is no reason to go and do that in transit. You see exactly the same with charging behavior. So again, with all due respect, but it is the same kind of behavior that you see. So we go to the next slide. Is there no problem then? Well, this in itself creates a problem, or a potential problem at least. And that potential problem is that if you look at the charging behavior that is a result of this, that charging behavior shows a camel shape, as we call it. And the camel shape is triggered by the fact that people arrive between 8 and 9 in the morning at their offices or their workplace, and they start to be connected. So you see the charge demand going up and the number of sessions going up between 8 and 9, and the actual amount of power being charged between 8 and 12 o'clock in the morning is a real peak. And the same is, of course, true when people leave their office or workplace and arrive home again or near their home and connect there, and then you have the same pattern once again. So the good news is that most people use it only for commute, so it's relatively small amounts of energy being transferred to the car. The average mileage for commute is about 20 to 25 miles, which means that you have a relatively small amount that you need to charge, but still you see these peaks because of the amount of sessions that take place. And you can imagine that if you look at the average amount of power that we charge on a working day, that is the orange line, that is no problem to the grid whatsoever. Absolutely not. We can easily get that amount of power available, even when we change to 70, 80% of conversion on EVs. So if we have in the market 70, 80% of EVs, we can still do this. It's not an issue. The issue is the 2 camel bumps, that the grid will never be able to cope with. So we have to find ways and means to mitigate that, which brings us to the next subject in the presentation, which is why you need the connected chargers. So to do one step back, what do we see? We see that we have various types of use of the car. So associated with work and home charging, that is clearly commute. That is clearly the people going to the office, going to their workplace, and returning home. You see that. You see people going long distance. So where I said, you know, the example that I gave, or the analogy that I gave, you know, you try to avoid to charge while you're on your way, while you're moving for a longer distance. When the distance is long enough, of course you have to. Of course you have to charge if you do a long haul. So if you're a salesperson and you do a quite some mileage per day, you will find yourself en route. That might be the same for small commercial vehicles, which also take longer distances. And then one of the things that we didn't touch upon so much in this presentation yet is the whole depot charging and the depot fleet, which is mainly used for the last mile deliveries. And particularly in the COVID era, we see, and you mentioned Amazon as an example, but it's not only Amazon, it's a lot of those companies that are in logistics that have seen an enormous boost in their activity, whereby cities ban diesels more and more, and ICE combustion engine cars, depending on where you are in Europe, a lot of cities plan to ban them or have already announced to ban ICE cars by 2030 to 2040 maximum. So you see a lot of pressure on those companies to go electrical or at least zero emission as well. And if you look at the energy density that you have with a battery vis-a-vis hydrogen, and if you look at the efficiency of the total chain with electricity compared to hydrogen, you see that for anything that is commercial, and that is last mile, and that is your private use, and that is normal commute use, etc., etc., battery is the winning technology by far. That will not change. For long hauls, you know, you get to a tipping point whereby the size and the weight of the battery exceeds what you can do efficiently in a truck for long hauls. So particularly for trucks and maybe even middle mile, you will see some hydrogen coming up. But for everything that we talk about here, it is battery, 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 and it will stay like that. On depot, you see, as said, you know, an enormous increase in the adoption of EVs on a very, very short term. If we go to the next, then we get to, you know, not all charging is equal, as the slide says, and what I already indicated is that we think that networked charging is necessary. And also you, Joe, mentioned it already. You know, if you look at what we are facing in this market, where we are today, even with the adoption in the Netherlands, for instance, where we are now close to 20%, you know, you still see that in the total market, so all the cars driving, you know, we are 5, 6, 7% of all vehicles are EV, which means that above 90% is still a combustion engine. So the installed base is not at the level that we see a lot of issues with charging at this moment in time. But if you go a few years ahead, you will see that the use cases have increased, the number of charges have increased, there is more demand on customer support. The fleet managers and site managers get more and more involved. There are discussions starting around availability of power at a certain plant. There are these camel effects that I just discussed. And if you then go to the right-hand side of this chart, you get a lot of discussions around insight, around the ability to charge the cost of the sessions to the right people at the right cost. You have things around maintenance, proactive maintenance, because you don't want to end up with charges that are out of order. You get grid connections, you get the availability of power over time, over day, that you have to mitigate and organize. So there is an enormous increase in complexity to cope with, you know, the 60, 70, 80% of adoption of EVs later on in this decade. If you go to the next slide. So what you could do at start, and which some countries did so far, is you have free charging. So you have a charge station, you have a driver, you allow that driver to charge at that station. You can do that for free. You don't need connectivity. Actually, you have a dumb charger, and you could have that dumb charger as well as at your home. You know, why wouldn't you? The why wouldn't you is multifold. So if we go to the next. So what you see with this increasing complexity, you see at the left-hand side, you see a driver that wants to be able to charge at various stations at the top. The fleet manager or the site manager at the right-hand side wants to be able to provide access to certain user groups to those stations. He or she wants to set tariffs to specific groups on those stations. He or she wants to have some kind of intelligent automated support to help him or her to know when the number of stations need to be extended. He or she wants to have the ability to increase utilization on the number of stations that are installed. And then on the driver support and the site support level, which is at the bottom of this chart, you need to be able to get access to a support officer or a support person in order to help you if something goes wrong, or if you want advice, or if you want support on, for instance, proactive maintenance and what have you. So that's why it's important that all of these things are connected. And in the case of ChargePoint, they are connected by the cloud and the cloud services. So you go to the next slide. So if you look at the ChargePoint universe and you click through, then you see, thank you, then you see that the driver at the left-hand side, he gets access to that cloud through the app. And what he can do is with that app or with a token, get access to the stations. What he can also do is see where stations are available and the status of those stations. What he can also do is plan his trip if it is a long trip. And what he can also do is have insight in what he charged and what he did so far. And very important as well, for instance, it can support the driver by being reimbursed for electricity that he uses in his company car when he charges at home. So if you look at the stations themselves, you have things like maintenance, you have things like access, you have things like utilization, for instance, with wait lists, with reservation and what have you. But you also have, and that may be interesting for some of the audience, the capability to identify groups and provide to those user groups what we call connections. And connections are a marketing tool to provide specific tariffs to those groups and have a marketing tool to get loyalty and retention schemes to groups of users that you want to provide that that preference to, or that specific price to. On the site manager and fleet manager side, you provide access, you provide insight, you provide statistics, you provide control, you provide the ability to include and exclude user groups, because you might have mixed use whereby you want to grant access to customers, suppliers, own staff having a company car, own staff having a private car, etc., etc. So you have a multifold of user groups that you want to do different things with and provide different access and access levels for. And then, of course, you have the driver support as well, the site support, that have online access to all of the stuff that we just discussed. So they can provide, based on the analysis to the fleet manager, a service which may be consultancy in the sense of I can help you to optimize the use of your stations. They can also do proactive maintenance, which we do. So before the site manager knows that a station is out of order, there is already somebody dispatched to go on site to already repair that station if repair is needed. Because interestingly enough, by having that connection, about 80 to 85% of the calls or the faults that are being seen on the stations can be resolved remotely. So you don't even have to send somebody as long as it's connected. So it's a lot of stuff around this cloud service, which hopefully give also the audience a little bit of feeling, you know, why dumb versus connected is not a question. And then we didn't even discuss about the future. Future-proofing your systems means also that you need to be able to update firmware, that you need to be able to know what kind of use you have. You know, it is like with your PC, there are versions of software that, you know, support the new features, and, you know, these new features you want to offer probably, and therefore firmware needs to be updated. It's all that kind of stuff which make a network system necessary. All right, then we go to the next.
Yeah, so this is a section for based on what we just talked about, Andre. What should people be thinking about if they're having to consider, you know, investments in this whole charging technology?
Yeah, so the first one to start with is actually not even on this slide. You know, the whole adoption of EV cars, and I can say that in an audience where 71% has some experience. You know, the reason to drive electric can be sustainability, can be certainly cost, and as I try to explain, in a few years' time, it will certainly be cost. And it can be other things, but one of the main things that people experience when going to EV is the big smile they have on their face, regardless their use case. Whether you want to drive in a luxury way, nice and quiet and silent, you can do that. If you want a little bit more aggressive drive style and you like the amount of horsepower, you have them. The amount of torque, you have it. The driver experience by having the weight very low in the car with the battery, it gives great experience in the drivability of a car. So in general, whoever you are, when you get into an EV, you will get a big smile. So that's the first thing to consider is it's fun. You know, it is more fun to drive an EV in general than anything else. And then you get into the what more business-like kind of key things to consider. So one thing to consider is that you want this nice experience for your drivers. You want the accessibility, you want the app, you want the ability to plan things for the driver. You want the ability to have reimbursement as an option, etc., etc. Then the next one is a solution that stands the test of time, which is this future proofing that I just discussed. You know, we get new solutions, for instance, for plug and charge that people may have heard of, which is laid down in a new ISO standard, 15118. Forget it immediately, not so important. But you need the stations to be upgraded, not only on software, but in this case also slightly on hardware. It is very important that you have stations that can be upgraded and a company working with you to create a smooth path to that future. You don't want your investment to be obsolete in 2 years' time. So that's a very important thing to consider. Making operating and managing station easy, that's, you know, things like access, things like the utilization, things like providing pricing, etc., etc. it shouldn't be so that you need 2, 3 people specially trained in a department that never had to do this and you know, have specialist care for your EV stations. That should be done by your facility manager or by somebody else that is already there and who can easily get access to all of that data and change it in a way that is easy to use, intuitive, and whereby you get the support of your supplier in case you have questions. So that's an important one. And then constant and operational readiness, very clear, you know, particularly if you don't have 100 stations yet. If you have 100 stations, one is out of order, it's not a real issue. If you have 3 stations, 6 cars, one is out of order, you have a massive issue. And that discomfort is what you try to avoid. So that constant operational readiness is very important. And therewith, this whole proactive maintenance that we can offer is something that, you know, might be a big difference, because effectively, instead of having one redundant station all the time, you don't need that. So it decreases your investment. And then mixed use between employees, visitors, and fleet vehicles, that has to do with access, that has to do with promotion, and certainly has to do with pricing and being able to have the proper pricing to your departments, but also to the customers, and to make it a viable business case. So those things together, once again, make it that you need a connected, networked set of stations, that you need a company to work with, hopefully ChargePoint, but it can be somebody else, but be at least aware that you need to get these kind of things taken into consideration if you make a decision how you want to establish your charging facility, and provide that to all of the use cases that we discussed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andre. Superb. We're going to do questions in a minute. Are there any other points you think you want to make before we start questions?
No, I think as we said, you know, this was a very generic webinar, so I hope that the audience got not necessarily a lot of news, but at least a complete story. You know, where are we today? What is coming towards us? What lies ahead of us? And what are the things that, you know, need to be considered, and how do companies mitigate that? So I think we did that as indicated by Catherine at the start. We will do specialized, more in-depth webinars on, for instance, fleet, on, for instance, workplace, whereby we deeper dive into those use cases and explain, for instance, in the fleet example, how we can integrate into the car planning system in order to be able to provide guaranteed availability of power in the cars for their route, but also, for instance, for bus and truck. How do you cope with things like charging there? Is that through a cable, or do you have different systems in order to get the power in a bus, for instance? And all of those more detailed things that we may be able to supply.
Brilliant. Great, thank you. So Catherine, do we have some questions?
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Joe and Andre. I would start with one that is, kind of linked to the networked part. Someone asked, can I add networked stations over time if my demand for charging increases?
Probably ask Andre to comment on that one, I think.
The answer to that is yes. The answer to that is it unlimited or not? It is never unlimited, of course. So there is 2 things to take into consideration here. One is, what is the available power to that specific site? So what is the the size of the pipe, if you want to put it like that, that is already in place. That is basically the key thing that determines how many you can get in total. Then the next thing to mention here is that you want to optimize the amount of power that you have available at all times to go to the charging stations. And interestingly enough, again, with the networked stations, you can do that by listening to the building, what the building is already using, and all the rest is then transferred into the ability to charge. So that is dynamic power management, as we call it, or dynamic power sharing, some companies call it. But that is the ability to continuously have the maximum amount of power going to your stations. In general, we don't see a real limitation of the number of stations as long as you have that power management in place, because otherwise you have to cap at the peak of the building, and that limits really.
Thanks, Andre. Then there is a question that maybe kind of goes into the range anxiety, but what about the number of people who do not have off-street parking, which is high in the UK?
Yeah. Don't know whether you want to take that, Joe. I can take it as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. A really, really good question, because lots of people live in flats or terraced houses and that sort of thing. I mean, I suppose in a way, Andre, it increases the reason of why businesses should care, because workplace becomes even more important for those people when they need to charge. But what else would you say about those circumstances?
Now, there's an interesting. There are two things happening at this moment in time. One is the whole discussion about the right to charge, and the right to charge means that municipalities have to provide you access to a charging facility within 150 meters or so around your house. It depends a little bit on the country, it depends on the municipality. It is not implemented in all regions or in all countries in Europe, but it is a discussion that takes place. And many municipalities already do this. So they provide you the right to charge. So if you have an EV and you have somewhere to park, and that has to be the case because otherwise you don't have a car at all, then you can go to the municipality and say, here, I want a charger, and they have to provide that. You will not get, in general, a reserved parking place. So that would be strange as well. So you have then the right to charge, but that right goes also to other inhabitants that live in a circle then of that distance to you. The other thing is that you see a lot of cities now starting to build charging facilities, which are a kind of grouped facilities, whereby they have specific areas in the city where you can kind of park and ride, put your car there. Less nice, if you ask me personally, but it happens at this moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
Then Ian Parker just asked, how standard are charging sockets, or is this very much like based on OEMs or car models? And how do we get to a universal solution here, like the station pump, for example?
Yeah, well, we are there. So it is the simple answer to that is finally and luckily we have come to a standard. So the standard is there. If you go 6 years back in time, there was Germany and France. What's new? So there was a French standard and there was a German standard. In the end, that all has gone. So we have one standard now. That is for AC charging. For DC fast charging, we still have two. But the good news is that they are kind of, going in one direction as well. And most of the DC fast charge stations still have both sockets already available. So there are in fact 3 in total, and DC has to be different than AC because of the You know, in DC you only have a plus and a minus, and in AC you have 3-phase, so the number of connectors are different. Therefore, you can never make that the same.
And there is another question concerning cars or the life cycle of EV batteries, that many people have fears on the life cycle of EV batteries. So what trend do you see when it comes to circularity in EV batteries, or perhaps in EVs as a whole?
It's a very interesting question, because that fear is real. The fear was that in 5 years' time, in normal use, the battery life would go down, or the battery capacity would go down to 65, maximum 70% of your original life. Tesla just published the results of their first 5-year-old cars, and they are consistently above 92%. And that's based on facts. So you see, if you do a proper battery management, that the battery life is much better than we all expected in the industry. So there seems to be less an issue. Then the circularity question is still a valid question, because there is an end of life on the car, you know, and you will have batteries that come back. There is 2 things that are happening there at this moment in time. One is the true recycling of the batteries, which is still at an early stage, I would say. So I would not dare to state at this moment in time that we have a worldwide recyclability of batteries in place, but it will get in place in time, and they are recyclable in the end. But secondly, and more interestingly, there is an enormous demand for batteries for energy storage. Because unfortunately, of course, the sun is not always as bright as we want it. So there is a lot of battery capacity needed to get wind and sun energy stored, also on a local level, but also on workplace level. And what you see nowadays is that for those battery storage use cases, the old batteries of cars are used, because it doesn't matter so much how heavy they are, and it doesn't matter so much whether they are at 70% or 80% of their initial capacity. So for the foreseeable future, that will certainly be the main and most sustainable reuse of the batteries.
Thank you. I think we could, we have time for one more question, and one that I could actually combine out of 2. So someone asked, why would I invest in workplace charging if some companies will install and run it for free? And are most organizations buying or leasing charging stations?
Why would I invest in workplace charging if some companies provide it for free? In that particular case, and if it's readily available around your workplace, I would never invest. You know, if somebody else invests in your charging capacity and provides it for free, make use of it. So don't even consider to do it. However, what you will find is that there is no such thing as a free ride in this world. So I can't imagine that there is not something in return of providing free charging and free energy, because the amount of energy is enormous and the cost of energy is still there. What you will see, however, is potentially that in the whole sustainable energy provision, we get to a different type of invoicing or price setting than we had before. So you might well see, and we don't know yet, it's not that we have the crystal ball, but there are indications that in the end, you get to a situation whereby you no longer pay for the kilowatt hour or the liter in comparison, but whereby you go to a kind of internet pricing. And what I mean with that is, nowadays, you don't pay anymore for megabytes that you use on your internet connection. What you pay is actually the bandwidth that you have available on your connection. And that might well go into the same direction with energy. So in the end, it might be that you pay for the bandwidth, and in this case, the amount of power that you have available on a site or at your house, whereby if your peak is then limited to 10 kilowatt, for instance, at your house, you pay a certain amount. But if you want a peak of 15, you pay a different amount, exactly the same as with your internet, where you also don't pay any longer for the internet used per megabyte. And some of us may be old enough to remember the days that you paid, particularly in the mobile world, per megabyte.
Yeah.
Long gone, Joe.
Indeed.
And the other question was that you come out lease. How many are leased and how many are interesting question. In the UK, lease for cars, so the lease market of cars is low compared to continental Europe. So in continental Europe, more cars are leased than in the UK. It's more an allowance-based market. And what you see in continental Europe is that lease companies provide the charges as part of the lease with the car. So then the lease infrastructure is leased together with the lease on the car. You see exactly the same in the UK, but that, as said, is slightly a slightly smaller market in the UK than in continental Europe.
Thank you, Andre. We are already over time, so I think we would wrap it up. If you have more questions, you can, of course, always reach out to us through our website and contact us via email or the contact form. I just want to make you aware of our upcoming webinars. We will have a little summer break, let's say, in August, and then start fresh in September and go more into detail with a fleet webinar. So the path to electrify your fleets. And then in October, we will follow with a webinar on successful or tips for successful workplace charging. All of you who have joined, you will receive, as said before, the on-demand version of this webinar. And of course, we will keep you posted on upcoming webinars via email, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to just get insights into ChargePoint and get to know when the next webinar will be coming. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Andre.
Bye.
Bye.